going to classify an obligation based on according to the number of parties. There are obligations which have more than one debtor, or there are more than one creditor. Okay. Now we're going to classify these kinds of obligation as to the liabilities of the parties, as to the liabilities of the number of debtor and the liabilities of the number of creditor. Like for example, Juan and Maria borrowed money from Pedro. Okay. Now question, how much can Pedro collect from Juan? Or how much can Pedro collect from Maria? Okay. You would only know the answer if you have classified the kind of obligation as regard to their liabilities. Now, you have to determine first whether their liability is joint or solidary liability. Okay, let's start with joint obligations. A joint obligation is one where the whole obligation is to be paid or fulfilled proportionately by different debtors and or is to be demanded proportionately by different creditors. In other words, here, if it is a joint obligation, each of the debtor can only be held liable up to the amount that they have benefited from the obligation, or up to the amount that they have promised that they are going to be liable. Okay? So like for example, Juan and Maria borrowed 1,000 pesos from Pedro. Out of the 1,000 pesos, Juan got 600 pesos while Maria got only 400 pesos. Now, can Pedro demand 1,000 from Juan? Can Pedro demand 1,000 from Maria? If it is a joint obligation, the law says that each of the debtor will only be held liable up to the amount they have benefited, or up to the amount they have assumed based on the obligation. So in our example earlier, Juan received only 600. Since it is a joint obligation, then Juan can only be held liable 600 pesos in favor of Pedro. That is joint obligation. And also Maria can only be held liable also up to 400 pesos to Pedro. Okay? Because the liabilities of the party is joint liability. And that is under the rule on joint obligations. So if you notice, in joint obligations, there are number of debts. There are as many debts as there are as many debtors. On the other hand, there are also as many credits as there are number of creditors. Okay? That's joint obligation. So, Pedro cannot demand the entire obligation or the 1,000 pesos from Juan alone. He cannot also demand the entire obligation or the 1,000 pesos from Maria alone, because the obligation is a joint obligation. Contrary or opposite to the joint obligation is what we call as the solidary obligation. In this solidary obligation, the liabilities of the parties are or is a solidary liability. So first, we defined what is a solidary obligation. Now, based on law, it says that a solidary obligation is one where each one of the debtor is bound to render and or each one of the creditor has a right to demand from any of the debtors entire compliance with the prestation. Okay? So now we go to the liability in solidary obligation or under solidary liability. Going back to our example earlier, we said Juan and Maria borrowed 1,000 pesos from Pedro. Now, out of the 1,000 pesos, Juan benefited 600 pesos while Maria benefited 400 pesos. Unfortunately, they agreed that their liability is not anymore joint but solidary. So, nag-agree sila duha na solidary ang ilang liability. So, what is the effect? Here, the law says that the creditor can demand performance of the entire obligation to any of the debtor. But pasabot, si Pedro can ask the entire 1,000 from any of the debtor, either from Juan or from Maria. Oh, question. unfair man na sir, nga naman, for 600 naman ang na-benefit ni 600 ang na-benefit ni Juan, 400 lang ang na-benefit ni Maria. Okay? Nga naman pwede kolektahan si Juan og 1,000. Nga naman pwede kolektahan si Maria og 400. Because the debtors in our example assume a solidary obligation. Had they assumed joint obligation, they would have only been liable up to the amount they have assumed liability based on the obligation. Okay? So, that's the difference between a joint obligation and a solidary obligation. The next question would be, how do you identify the obligation, whether it's a joint obligation or solidary obligation? Okay? Now, here, it says that where there are plurality of parties, the presumption is that the obligation is a joint obligation. Ingon niya, if there is more than one debtor, or if there is more than one creditor, the presumption is that the obligation is a joint obligation. Automatic. If they did not agree, what kind of obligation is that, or what kind of liability they are assuming, automatic, the law presumes that they are assuming a joint obligation. So meaning, first, if there is no agreement of the parties, and there are more than one debtor, or there are more than one creditor, the presumption is that their liability is only joint liability. Okay? That's the first instance where you can conclude that the obligation is a joint obligation. Okay? And then, next, when the parties agreed that they are going or assuming a joint liability. Okay? So in that case, there is an express agreement of the parties that they are assuming a joint liability. So, of course, since they have agreed that their liability is joint, then the rule also on joint obligation will apply. Okay. Now, if you see the word, or if you see these words in an obligation, it means that the obligation is a joint obligation. Like the word 1, joint. Number 2, the word proportionate. Or number 3, the word pro rata. If you see these words in an obligation, it means that the liabilities of the parties are joint liabilities. Okay? Like for example, Juan and Maria borrowed 10,000 pesos from Pedro and promised to pay Pedro jointly. So you have seen the word joint or jointly. It means that their obligation is a joint obligation. Another example, Juan and Maria borrowed money from Pedro, the amount of 1,000 pesos, and they promised Pedro to pay the obligation proportionately. Okay? So there is a word proportionately. It means that the obligation is a joint obligation. Or another example, Juan and Maria borrowed money from Pedro, the amount of 1,000 pesos, and they promised to pay Pedro pro rata. Okay, there is a word pro rata, which means that the obligation is a joint obligation. Or, Juan and Maria borrowed money from Pedro, the amount of 1,000 pesos, and they promised to pay Pedro, period. Oh, you have not seen any words indicating joint liability. There is no word of joint. There is no word proportionate. There is no word pro rata. So what is now the liabilities of the parties, or what kind of obligation is that as to the liabilities of party? Then you apply now the presumption, which means that since the parties did not agree, then the law says that the obligation is a joint obligation. Okay? That's the basic rule in joint obligation. Now, what about solidary obligation? How would we know that the obligation is a solidary obligation? Now, the law says that there is solidarity only when, when the obligation expressly so states. Meaning, The obligation itself says that the liabilities of the parties are solidary liabilities. Okay? That is expressly mentioned in the obligation. Again, if there is no mention as to the liabilities of the parties, then the presumption applies that the obligation is a joint obligation. Okay? Second, when the law requires solidarity. Third, the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. And fourth, when it is imposed by final judgment against several defendants. These are the only 4 instances wherein you could conclude that the liabilities of the parties is a solidary liability. Okay? Again, the difference between joint and solidary liability is that in joint liability, the creditor can only collect up to a certain amount with regard to each of the debtor. When it is a solidary liability, the creditor can demand or can collect the entire obligation from any of the debtor. Okay? Now, how do you know, or what are the words indicating that there is solidarity? Okay. So, if you find these words in an obligation, solidary, or joint and solidary, individually and collectively, in solidum, each will pay the whole value. These are the words. If you find it in an obligation, it means that the obligation is a solidary obligation. So example, Juan and Maria borrowed money, the amount of 1,000 pesos from Pedro, and they promised to pay Pedro solidarily. So you found the word, you will find the word solidary, which means that the obligation is a solidary obligation. Or, Juan and Maria borrowed money from Pedro, the amount of 1,000 pesos, and both of them promised to pay Pedro jointly and solidarily. Or, they assume joint and solidary obligation. So, which means that the obligation is a solidary obligation. Another example, Juan and Maria borrowed money from Pedro, the amount of 1,000 pesos, and both promised to pay Pedro individually and collectively. Okay? So which means that the obligation is a solidary obligation. In solidum and so on, in solidum, and each will pay the whole value. Okay? So those are the important matters relating to the kind of obligation as to the number of parties. You only classify this obligation when there are more than one debtor or there are more than one creditor. If there is only one debtor and there is only one creditor, you don't need to classify. Why? Because only one can be held liable, and then only one also will be entitled to the entire obligation. So no need to classify when there is only one debtor and there is only one creditor. You only apply these rules when there are more than one debtor or more than one creditor. Okay? So those are the important matters relating to joint and solidary obligations. Then another obligation, kinds of obligation, this time according to the object of the obligation. Okay? So we have a divisible obligation and indivisible obligation. This is found under slide number 68 of the synopsis that I have given to you. So divisible obligation is one capable of partial performance, meaning you can divide the performance of the object or the performance of the obligation. For example, to deliver 200 kilos of sugar. What is the object in this obligation? Sugar, 200 kilos of sugar. So which means that you can divide the performance of this obligation. Then another one is indivisible obligation. One not capable of partial performance, which you cannot divide the performance of the obligation. So example is to deliver a 2016 Toyota Fortuner with plate number AAA 111. So in that case, you cannot divide the performance of the obligation because you cannot deliver wheels first or engine first, you have to deliver the entire thing. So that is an indivisible obligation. Now, it is important it is important to know these two kinds of classification because we have a special rule when the obligation is a joint obligation at the same time and indivisible obligation. Okay? Joint and indivisible obligation. What does it mean? It means that there are more than one debtors or more than one creditors because it's a joint obligation, and this applies only when there are plurality of parties. So joint obligation means that there is more than one debtor or there are more than one creditor. Okay? Indivisible, meaning the object of the obligation is not capable of partial performance. That's indivisible obligation. So example, Juan and Maria promised to deliver unto Pedro a specific car. Okay? So if you look at it, there are more than one debtor, Juan and Maria. And the object of the obligation is a specific car, which is an indivisible. Now, if they did not agree, since the obligation is a joint obligation, meaning Pedro, the creditor, can only demand a portion of the obligation from each of the debtor, being a joint obligation. Okay? Why problema kung capable sila of performing everything? Kay ma-deliver yun ang obligation. What if dili sila capable of performing everything? So, ang may tabo, matunga ang indivisible object. Dili po di mo pwede tungaon ang indivisible object because it is an indivisible obligation. So, here is the rule. In joint indivisible obligations, the debtors who does not comply with this undertaking can be held liable for damages. However, debtors who are ready to fulfill shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond their corresponding portion of the price of the thing or the value of the service. What does it mean? It means when it is a joint obligation at the same time, having an indivisible object, all you need to do is to convert the object into its value. So in our example earlier, a specific car, you get the value of the specific car. If either Juan or Maria is ready to fulfill his corresponding share in the obligation, they will be allowed to perform their obligation. So which means that they can pay their corresponding share. What about the other one who is not yet ready? The law says that he can be held liable for damages. Okay? So that's the importance why you need to classify whether the obligation is divisible or indivisible. Because of the fact that sometimes obligations are joint and indivisible obligations. So you apply those rules on the obligation. And then last is the obligation with a penal clause. Okay. What is this obligation with a penal clause? Now, an obligation with a penal clause simply means that it is an obligation which provides for a penalty in case of failure of performance by the debtor. Eh? Kanang mga obligation na nagbuhat og penalty mismo sa obligation kung dili makapulfill si debtor sa iyang obligation. Example, Juan promised to pay Pedro 1,000 pesos. And both parties agreed that if Juan fails to pay Pedro within 1 month, Pedro shall be held liable for interest at the rate of 10% per annum. Okay? So there is a penalty there. What is the penalty? If Juan cannot pay his obligation to Pedro, Juan can be held liable for interest. That is the penalty. Okay? So a penalty, therefore, or a penal clause is a coercive means to obtain from the debtor compliance. But pasabot, gibutang na ang penalty diha para mapugos si debtor nga mo fulfill sa iyang obligation because it is a coercive mean. Nga naman, because he does not want to pay additional interest kay if he fails to perform his obligation, he will be paying an interest. Okay? And that is what we call as a penalty or a penal clause. So that's an obligation with a penal clause. So those are the different kinds of obligations.